At this point, I'm going to assume that you've already installed Rails. If you haven't, then you should go to one of the installation screencasts and come back after you've installed it. I should mention also that things don't always just work when you install Ruby and Rails and all of the associated software. So I definitely encourage you to Google the error message. That is the universal algorithm for debugging things in Ruby on Rails web development, and indeed in life. Okay, so once you've gotten Rails installed, then setting up the first application is easy. We can start by making a directory for our Rails projects, and then change directories to that directory. And now I'm going to make the first application using the Rails script that comes with Ruby on Rails. So it's Rails. To make a new application, we type new and then the name of the application. This syntax, by the way, is new in Rails 3. In previous versions of Rails, you would just type Rails first app, and I'll mention in a couple of minutes why they made that change. There we go. It's the script is run, and you can see it created a bunch of files and directories. And this is one of the most useful things about Rails, actually. It seems kind of silly, but this was one of the first differentiators for Rails. This is what one of the things that got people's attention, is that there was this standard directory structure. And it's really nice because it means that you can orient yourself in a new Rails project right away. If you look at someone else's Rails project, you can pretty much tell where things go. So I'm going to open the current directory, open dot. This command will not work unless you're running OS 10. And you can see here that we've got our first app. And let's take a look at it. So this is the application directory structure for every Rails application. So there's an application directory, the app directory. And then there are controllers, models, and views. You may have heard about the MVC, or model view controller pattern. We'll be covering that, especially in the next lesson. There's a config directory. There's a log directory. We'll be covering most of these directories and most of these files throughout the rest of the tutorial. But at this point, it's nice just to get an overview of what the structure is. There is a lot to take in here, and you should know that eventually this directory structure will be burned in your brain, and you won't have to think about it very much. But it can be overwhelming. I remember when I first learned Rails web development, I was just so confused about where does that file go? Where does this file go? So throughout especially the early lessons of this tutorial, I'll be emphasizing where everything lives. And then eventually, later in the tutorial, I think it'll sink in. And at this point, let's navigate into our first app directory. At this point, we actually have a working Rails application, although we're not going to run it right away because there's one step we have to do first. And this is the same with every Rails 3 application, which is to install all of the gems needed by the application. And the list of those gems is in a file called the gem file. So let's list the current directory just to take a look. Here are some of the directories that we just saw. And here's the gem file. So let's open it. I'm going to open it with my favorite editor, which is TextMate. You should use your favorite editor. And here it is. This is our very first Ruby file. This is actually a Ruby file. So the first Ruby file in this tutorial. It won't be our last. This character here, this little hash character, or sometimes called the pound sign, is the Ruby comment character. So you can ignore everything that's commented out here. Let's just focus on these lines. This is a gem, Rails, and then the version of Rails, 3.0.0.rc. This says that Rails needs Rails to run. And this, remember, this RC here is release candidate. By the time you watch this, it might be a different version, but you shouldn't worry about that, especially since this version is actually just generated by the Rails new first app command we ran. So it'll be whatever the right version is, corresponding to the version of the Rails script you ran. The other line here is the SQLite 3 Ruby. So SQLite is a really nice lightweight database that is great for use in development mode. It's not used for any production web applications that I know of, although it is good for embedded devices. But it's so lightweight and easy to set up that it's the Rails default for development. This might just work for you, this SQLite 3 Ruby gem, but I need to install a particular version. So SQLite 3 Ruby is a gem that tells Ruby how to talk to SQLite databases. So I need version 1.2.5. Now don't worry about this syntax here. We'll be covering what this means later in the tutorial. At this point, let's just be satisfied with our complete gem file. And the next step is also always the same. Once we've got our gem file all set up, we need to install the gems using a program called Bundler that has already been installed automatically as part of Rails. And the way we install the gems using Bundler is by typing bundle install. All right, so Bundler has installed the gems we need. If that didn't work for you, you should follow the Google the error message algorithm. You might also want to check Chapter 1 in the Ruby on Rails tutorial book. There are some things you might have to install. So, for example, some users of Ubuntu Linux have reported that there are some extra packages they have to install. So check out the book for the latest on that. But I hope it just worked for you. As you can see, it just worked for me. And so at this point, what we're going to do is actually run our application in our local environment. The way to run it is to type Rails server. And now you see why before we typed Rails new and then the name of the application. This command used to be called script server, but now that you use the Rails script to run the server, there is the danger that you would type Rails server in a directory that wasn't a Rails application. So if you type Rails inside a Rails application, it knows to run a particular version of the script. If you run outside of a Rails application, it used to just make a project with that name. So you would type Rails server, but it wouldn't be a Rails application, and you ended up creating an application called server, and that was no good. So that's why they switched it over to Rails new and then the name of the app. So here we go, Rails server, and you can see it's got the version number. Again, don't worry about exactly which version it is. And then it says starting in development, and this is one of the three main modes that Rails applications run in. We'll be talking about that later in the tutorial. And then it says the address. It says on this address, http://0.0.0.0:3000. So let's take a look at what happens if we paste this into the address bar here. And there we go. Look at that. Welcome aboard. You're writing Ruby on Rails. So before we move on, I want to mention that nobody ever calls it this weird numeric address. This is all zeros. This is always called localhost. At least almost always. I don't know anyone who doesn't call it localhost. By the way, this 3000 is a port number. This just tells, in this case, the web browser how to connect to this application. By default, web applications and indeed all web pages run on port 80. So if you type, say, google.com, that's automatically connecting to port 80. But running on port 80 requires special privileges, usually either administrative privileges or you have to run as a special web server user. And so web application frameworks usually run on some higher port number, so 8000 or 8080, and in this case, 3000. So now we're at localhost 3000, which you'll see is exactly the same thing. And there's this line, look at that, about your application's environment. Let's click on that and see what happens. And there we go, look at that. It has a whole bunch of information about our application environment. So this is, maybe not too exciting. It's just a more or less static web page. But this is actually running as a web application on our local machine. And so that's a huge step forward. That's a big accomplishment.